I believe it's recording. Yes, it's recording.
Yes, it says, I've got a thing here said it's you are recording the call, which is no bad thing, so that's okay.
Just one moment.
Yeah, no problem.
Another hiccup. We'll get there in the end.
Yeah, I know. It's okay. It always takes a little bit of time to get these things set up, but
That's
yes,
right.
of course we'll get there in the end. Not a problem.
How was your journey in this morning?
Well, mine wasn't too bad. I must admit, I left Brighton early, and because of that, I got into Cambridge in good time. So I'm okay with that. I must admit. How was yours?
It's fun. I'm at home today, so.
Well, there you are. Then. Not a problem.
No.
You can just get up when you want to, have cereal, and stroll into the day. If only that's the case for us all.
Yeah, but still, it has its disadvantages in a sense. You find yourself getting up a lot earlier and going to bed a lot later than expected. But
yeah, that's often the way, I'm afraid.
Yeah, that's right. Right, so shall we get started? I think the way this works with Skype is that we'd have to be quite careful not to talk over one another so that the recording is crisp and clear. So I'll start off. I guess we can start now.
Okay, fine.
Just firing over questions to you to get an understanding, or really an introduction of who you are, a little bit of background about you, and what you're up to at present, and where you sit within the organization you're working in.
Okay, right. That's not a problem.
Okay.
Yeah, fine. Do you want me to kick off?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, good morning, everybody. My name is Jerry Shoolbred. I'm the Clerk of Works for Anglia Ruskin University. What a Clerk of Works does is effectively overlook the site quality control of all the construction projects within the university. So what I do, I take hold of the architect specifications and drawings, and then I check them against what the contractor has actually produced, just to make sure that the university isn't being shortchanged. So any material changes, colour, quality, etc., all has to run through me first, just so I make sure we're getting value for money. And also, if there's any defects, I will spot these in good time with the contractor, so they know what they've got to do. Basically, that's my role in a nutshell. And we are here working on 3 campuses, so I'm peripatetic. In other words, I travel around where the work is.
Okay. And how long have you been in the industry of the Clerk of Works?
Well, as a Clerk of Works, I've been doing this particular role for getting on for 40 years now. I started off being a carpenter and joiner. I was a tradesman. I did a 4-year apprenticeship. Then I became a charge hand and then a foreman. And then circumstances came along and I swapped over from being on the contractor side to the client side by becoming Clerk of Works. I went on a training course and a year-long course, and I started being a Clerk of Works first as an assistant clerk for about 6 years down in Infield, and then as a fully fledged Clerk of Works, fully qualified Clerk of Works, back in whenever that was, 85, 86, 87. Seems a long time ago now.
Okay, so that's good. A little bit of background about you. Would you be able to educate our listeners who perhaps don't know that much or have a full understanding of the role of the Clerk of Works within the construction industry, perhaps start off by telling us when the Clerk of Works was founded, how it's evolved over time, and its significance within the role of a construction project?
Yeah, certainly. In fact, it would be my pleasure to. The role of the Clerk of Works has been around for a long, long time. Originally, the role of the Clerk of Works developed during the Middle Ages, when the country was going through a huge regeneration, particularly the churches. The churches had lots and lots of money, so they employed one of their clerics, who was seen as one of the most literate at the time because they could read, they could write, to record all the materials that were coming onto site to build the famous abbeys and cathedrals we have in this country, because obviously a lot of stone and timber used to get pilfered. So the clerks then became the journeymen. They organised the tools, they organised the journeymen, the stonemasons, the carpenters who actually worked on these things, and they also looked after the quality. So their role evolved right the way through until more or less the Reformation, when Henry VIII did away with a lot of these things, a lot of the cathedrals. But by then, the role was fairly well established. So the Clerk of Works, or building managers, also remained prevalent on the great houses, the great estates that we had up and down in the country, on the royal palaces. Hampton Court, Tower of London, all had Clerks of Works. In fact, over the years, a number of very famous people, Geoffrey Chaucer, of course, who wrote the Canterbury Tales. He was, for about 7 or 8 years, a Clerk of Works, the Clerk of the King's Works, I think it is, in South London.
Yep.
And the Clerk of Works then tended to fade out for a little bit until the Great Reform Acts in the 1832. But of course, the architects were the bee's knees in the construction industry, and Clerk of Works were employed by the architects then to work alongside them to look at the quality control on the job. In fact, when the Houses of Parliament were rebuilt in the 1840s, 1850s to 60s, Clerk of Works there had a great deal of involvement with the architect on that one. They didn't get on particularly well, but nonetheless they were there. And then back in, I can't remember exactly when it was, I think it was 1882, a group of Clerk of Works got together in London and they decided they needed to form their own organisation. A lot of trades and guilds had their own associations, and these guys, there was only about 17 or 18 of them, decided to form a group of Clerk of Works, and they became effectively the Institute of Clerks of Works, of which the name has more or less stayed the same. In the last 10 years, we've changed it to become the Institute of Clerks of Works and Construction Inspectors, because there's a lot more people out there now doing quality control work on behalf of the client who aren't called Clerk of Works. Clerk of Works is still seen as quite a historic name.
Yes.
But the role of what we do really hasn't changed that much in 600, 700 years.
Okay. Brilliant.
Okay.
So how would you explain in a nutshell the advantages of a Clerk of Works to the client in terms of cost and quality? I know when we spoke on the phone, you mentioned you touched on briefly how a number of clients find themselves in litigation disputes due to the fact that perhaps work wasn't monitored quality-wise on site, which led them going to court. Could you touch on a little bit of the advantages of having a clerk on work on site or working alongside the client to avoid any disputes getting to the point of litigation?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest problems that most contractors and clients have come across nowadays, certainly from the client's perspective, not a lot of clients really fully understand the modern construction process. What they want is a shiny new building for as cheap as they possibly can, as soon as they possibly can. So they tend to employ an architect first to develop the drawings and the specifications for that particular thing. Then they'll engage a contractor to actually give them a proper price, a proper working model.
Yeah.
The only problem is that sometimes the contractors will say, well, of course, costs have gone up nowadays. You know, who says that money doesn't grow on trees? Well, having seen the latest timber prices, it certainly does. And with that, of course, it brings issues. Suddenly, the modern contracts nowadays, one of them being design and build, the JCC design and build contract, allows for a term called value engineering, which I think is a complete misnomer because there's no value in it at all. All it produces a lot of cheaper buildings for the client, and a lot of clients initially think, oh, that's great, we've got a building that's actually costs less than what we thought. Well, no, because what you've actually done is valued all the good stuff out of it. So instead of having to start doing repairs in 5, 10, 15 years time, you'll probably find yourself starting to do repairs in 1, 2, 3 or 4 years time. And all the cost savings that you might have made initially have gone straight out the window. So we're finding nowadays that clients are employing clerk of works to look after the quality. A clerk of works will make regular inspections on site just to make sure that they are working alongside the architects, checking the drawings and the specifications, actually to make sure that the contractor isn't taking any shortcuts and the is getting exactly what they've paid for. This is what a clerk of works does. It makes sure that the contractors really don't cut too many corners. Yes, of course, we can take advice on things, but most clerk of works are extremely experienced. We have become far more litigious nowadays, and you'll see no end of court cases. But I'm always going to refer back to the lawyer Tony Bingham. Tony Bingham was a famous Temple Bar lawyer who used to write in Building magazine many years ago on all sorts of property and construction related. And he said quite famously that the cost of a clerk of works for 1 year equates to the cost of 1 day in court. Now, that was 10 years ago. So probably the divide of that now is probably greater. Wise words, I always thought.
Yeah. So do you believe that a clerk of works should be pulled in at the very early stages of a design, let's say concept design, rather than, let's say, looking at the RIBA plan of work, bringing them in at construction, because by then, in a sense, it's too late. The design has been frozen and they're now getting ready to build. What are your views on that?
I do honestly believe that construction phases demand almost that a clerk of works comes in at design state of the RIBA stage 4, where we can use our experience. If we already have some knowledge of the client anyway, to get to know their own particular quirks, what they like, what they dislike, and we can use our experience from previous contracts that we've done to help influence the architect and therefore sometimes the client on a best way forward, a more practical solution maybe to an inherent issue that may well come up. It's about trying to reduce as many of the risks as possible. At the moment, we are still brought in at stage 5, and I really think that's too late.
Yeah.
You're right in what you're saying. By then, the prices, the job aspect, the complete thing has been frozen. The client doesn't want to spend any more money. And sometimes we can't really point out to them and say, well, actually, on this particular fire corridor, you'll find that 30 meters is far too far away from the fire escape doorway. You need to put a doorway in here or a protected lobby there, or that particular element of brickwork may not work precisely well. You maybe need to do some practicing or introduce another corbel here or there to ease the design forward. Most clerk works, because they are fairly senior in the construction industry, have years worth of experience behind them, and I think that's been proven time and time again. Yes.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting point, because when you look at the JCT contract, again, going back to the point where the clerk of work is actually brought in at stage 5 rather than a lot earlier, it makes sense why we're getting a lot of disputes on site in reference to the quality. And if this small element within the project can be resolved, then the likelihood of court cases, mediations, such legal disputes rising will fall massively.
Well, of course, I mean, the most expensive person that anyone will ever hire in the course of a project is probably a lawyer.
That's right.
For the simple reason that the costs that they do going to court are absolutely astronomical. No one wants to get there. No one wants to get to court. The client wants a nice, bright, shiny new building that has few defects as possible. The contractor wants the satisfaction of knowing that he's done a good job and is prepared to work with that particular client again. And of course, the architect, let's not forget the architect and all the consultants want to be in that position where they've produced a brand new job. The client is happy. It looks great on their CVs as well. There may be an award or two in it. That's where we all want to get to.
That's right.
In terms of construction, a problem-less construction would be absolutely the way to go. Not always practical, unfortunately.
I guess it's starting to have that conversation and discussion, and then see where that goes, and educating more people out there within the industry to take that initiative to bring a clerk of works on board a lot earlier than traditionally.
Well, I think that is the case. I mean, it does seem to be, in the last year or two, there does seem to be a bit of a change. Unfortunately, there have been the problems of the 17 Edinburgh schools, where the walls fell down, and because of incorrect work that was done by the contractor, that was done in too much of a rush. And of course, there's been the disaster we've had in London at Grenfell, where people have seen that it wasn't managed properly, where if the client had brought in a clerk of works while they were doing the refurbishment stage, it would have certainly been a lot safer.
That's
now,
right.
Having read the report of Grenfell, of course, there was a whole mitigating set of circumstances that led to that unfortunate tragedy. But I do think that if the client had employed a clerk of works in the first place, would have certainly alleviated a lot of that particular situation. I really do believe the clerk of works is a tremendous value to the construction industry. And it defeats me why more clients don't really employ clerk of works, just because they think they might be saving some money.
Yeah, good point. What's on that? What are your views on how technology will enhance the role of the clerk of works? I say that because, from my experience, what I find is the clerk of works I come across, they still work on a traditional pen and paper when going out on site. But with all the new technology that's out, with all the apps, we have like snagging apps and BIM. I'm just wondering how will these new digital technologies empower the clerk of works to do the job better?
Well, I think certainly with BIM is a very good case in point. The drawings and the Revit models that are produced from BIM should you clash-free services in your construction. So providing you've got enough wall area, you should be able to design it so all the electrics and the trunking and all the ventilation work go neatly side by side, hand in hand, all neatly in a void. However, a lot of problems are still being caused on site because a particular engineer hasn't installed his piece of cable tray exactly where he's supposed to, or because the bricklayer or the concrete engineer hadn't designed the right size of duct through the particular wall or that floor to take that particular size of ductwork and or cable tray. So there's still a need in that respect to do manual physical checking on site. There is nothing better than a third-party independent inspection to check that things are done right in the first place. You'd think normally you'd be able to rely on a contractor to do this, but frankly, they tend not to. They tend not to have the time to be able to do this, which is where a Clerk Works comes in. And talking of the modern technology, yes, of course, there are a number of very good apps out there that we can use with our iPads and our phones. Things like Field View Pro, for example. A number of contractors are taking up using that and maybe adapting it slightly for their own thing. That's great, but for the individual, of course, these apps, to get on board with them, cost about £5,000, and that prices a lot of the maybe individual self-employed clerk works. That's a lot of money to get involved for just one app that you might only use or get on board with one job. Now, there are other apps, of course. There's Snag R, and there's another one which escapes me at the moment that's a lot cheaper, which enables one to take a photograph of a particular defect, then send it to a person, to a project manager, to an architect, to record the fact that you've spotted it. So as we move along, the technology is starting to catch up, and a lot more Clerk Works are starting to embrace it now. In the last few years, we've seen the rise of the social media element things, you know, with Instagram and FaceTime and Facebook, all that, of course. Well, a lot of that is now turning into the professional technology stages. Things like LinkedIn, of course, have a number of professional groups on there. Clerk Works have their own, where they discuss what defects they've come across. There's also another one that deals particularly with services, problems with construction services, best ways to avoid. There's some very interesting conversations going on there. So although they may be thousands of miles apart, Clerk are getting on board with the technology nowadays. It is taking a time. A lot of it we all wish was a bit cheaper, but it is still coming together. Yes, definitely.
Brilliant. Would you be able to give us some examples from your experience where the client has benefited immensely from having a Clerk Works come on board at an early stage, and also the disadvantage of a client bringing Clerk Works on board perhaps at the traditional stage 5, and reference that back to the cost, the quality, and the time that had on the project as a whole?
Well, I can give you one very good example of that from my own experience. Many years ago, I used to be the principal Clerk Works at Hertfordshire County Council, and when we were hosted out, as the popular term was, to a facility management company. This one particular year, back in about 2000, I think it was, the Hertfordshire County Council embarked on a grand scheme called the Boreham Wood Project. And the Boreham Project here involved in effectively the rebuilding and remodelling of 2 comprehensive schools and 6 primary JMI schools. Now, as we did in those days, I had to do a bidding. I had to put in a business case for supplying Clerk Works quality on this particular scheme. However, I just finished off all the work, and my manager called me in and said, "I'm sorry, Jerry, but the contractor here, it's a different form of design and build contract they're using here, and they don't actually want clerk works on the site. And I said, well, why not? Who's going to be looking after the quality? Not going to be the
Yes.
and surely it's not going to be the builder. And they said, well, I'm sorry, that's the case as it is. Anyway, it was a lovely hot summer that particular year. The project started in about March time. And in July, I got a phone call from one of the head teachers of the junior schools, and said, he said, because I'd worked with him before, I'd put a small extension on his school about 3 years previously. He and I had got on very well. He said, I've got a particular problem with this job. Would you mind coming down with what the contractors on this Boreham Wood project have stuck me with, and I'm not happy about it at all? And I said, well, of course I'll come down. I'm not supposed to, but I'll come and have a look. And I met him in the car park of the school, and walked around the side, past the new toilet extension that he'd had on, and then going round the outside of the playing field, right the way down near the bottom of the playing field. It was fairly obvious that there was a trench that went right the way down on the side, and it finished in a lovely, lush, verdant green sprawl of undergrowth. Now, bearing in mind that the playing field was dry and fairly brown, I could only assume what the problem was. So I walked over to it, and in fact, yes, it was an open sewer. The contractor had finished off doing the drain from the new school extension, and he'd taken it over as far as the edge of the playing field, and just left it there. So I said, well, there was no protective fencing or anything around it, and of course all the soil had made all the grass in this area grow absolutely extraordinarily long. So I managed to get hold of the site manager, and I said, I think this school's got a particular problem. Would you mind coming over? And he said, of course, yes. So we came over, we had a little discussion, and I said, so why have you left this as an open sewer on the edge of a school playing field? And he said, well, we are connecting up to a drain that's on the other side of that particular line, on that other school, that other JMI school over there. And then it's already been worked back from the road, but we couldn't access that field until the summer holidays. So I said, in the meantime, since March, when you started this particular role, since you've built this drain, it's been left as an open sewer for 3 months. Do you not think that's a bit of an issue? And he said, I don't know what happened to the fencing. And I said, well, the reason I'm telling you this is because if I was a parent at the school, knowing full well that you'd left an open drain on the school field and my child might have fallen into it, I might have beaten the living proverbial out of you. As it is, I'm about 2 clicks away from phoning up the health and safety executive and having you reported for extremely dangerous and unsafe practice. Well, obviously, he took real affrontage to this.
Yeah.
And I said to the head teacher, as he stormed off, I said to the head teacher, if you wouldn't mind doing us a favour, if you wouldn't mind phoning up the head of education when you get back to your office, and telling him about this particular conversation we've had, it might help me out a little bit. And lo and behold, less than 2 hours later, I'm sitting back in my office in Hertford, and I get a phone call from the head of property services saying, can you please make sure that the clerk works are put on all the jobs in the Boreham Wood project from immediate effect? It's quite clear that this particular incident caused at this school. We can't have this again. And just on that same project, one of my services clerk works went into one of the secondary schools and found that the big, whatever it was, 4,000 metre extension that they had put on a particular school had in fact been wired up through the mains wrongly. So when they've started doing their commissioning and testing, it blew all the fuses because it had been wired up wrongly in the first place. If our clerk works had been in there from the start, our service clerk works, he would have picked this out to the contractor straight away. The problem had arisen because they'd had a number of changes in the electrical contractor, and they hadn't left a full record of what they were doing before the next lot took over. Really dreadful work. I mean, the scheme itself went from bad to worse, and instead of being a 2-year project, it ended up being a 4.5-year project because they didn't do it properly. And I have to say, never worked for Hertfordshire County Council again.
Okay, and to oppose that, could you give an example of a very good project where Clerk Works was brought on board? I'm assuming at an earlier stage.
Yeah, well, I can think of an awful number. There's been lots of examples. One of my own colleagues in London was brought into a scheme right at the early stages where they had started to do a new build, a new private property build that included balconies. And the Clerk Works there pointed out to the architect that this particular design of balcony that he'd done had not included the proper fire stops at the right stages as it was being built into the framework. And then the architect went away and checked his design, and then along with the structural engineer, and said, of course, we'd completely missed that particular one because the conceptual, not the conceptual design, but the manufacturer's product had slightly changed and therefore would not fit correctly into the hold. And if they'd left it, of course, you'd have had whatever it was. I think he said it was about 43 balconies on this particular project, would have been effectively unsafe. They were only small balconies, but a balcony nonetheless. It was one of these Juliet type rails. And another colleague of mine was working in a hospital where he was checking specifications for the paints. Now, as you're probably aware, in hospital, they have a number of different types of microcellular antibacteria paints are involved in lots of different areas to stop the spread of infection and so forth. And the Clerk Works had going through the checking specifications as to what the client's design guide had said, and noted that the architect had forgotten to include a number of these antibacterial paints in a particular protected area. Pointed it out to the architect, who then, of course, went, yeah, hands up, it's my fault, I didn't think about that. Got it changed straight away. So that was before it even got to the site. And there's been a number of other examples where I can think of where, although we use all these smart tools nowadays to do all our AutoCAD drawings, etc., sometimes it's practical, far more practical, actually, to see the physical element, to be able to understand the issues, floor finishes, colour types, all those things that blend in and help. And if a Clerk of Works, of course, has got working knowledge of his client anyway and knows particular things they like, it makes a huge difference. It really does. Yeah.
Okay, so based on your experience throughout your career as a Clerk of Works, do you believe there's a particular sector within the construction industry that tends to navigate towards bringing a Clerk of Works on board, or take that a step, I guess, higher, a certain complexity to a project where a client automatically thinks, yes, we need a Clerk of Works on board, or do you find that's not the case?
Well, I think a lot of it steps right the way back to the beginning. When I've spoken to a number of clients and ask them why they're not employing a Clerk Works, they say, well, I'm employing an architect on one side. He's doing all my drawings and my specifications. Doesn't he look after the quality? And then on the other hand, I'm also employing a contractor. I'm paying him a lot of money to look after this particular element. Does he not look after And what about the building control officer or the approved? Do they not look after the quality? Well, no, they'll only look after the quality in terms of the compliant items to make sure things are as the building regulations. The architect will, of course, look after quality, but only if he's paid to. And the contractor, of course, has a certain amount of an obligation, but they are trying to control all their subcontractors out on site. So they don't tend to look after quality that much either. What the industry needs to have properly to make sure we don't have all these issues that have been recorded into the building industry nowadays is to have a proper site inspector, a clerk of works, a quality control manager who can be completely independent and look after all of these elements and advise the project manager, the architect, the contractor of things that are wrong as they go along. That is the way it used to be 20, 30 years ago. And I'm afraid that's the way it should be now. I mean, nowadays, of course, are in the press as well. There's persimmons who've come up with their retention scheme now. If there is a problem, that there is a sum of money that they can go back to help these first-time buyers and so forth. Well, really, persimmons and a lot of the house builders, they should have been doing this years ago. Why have they only just jumped on it now? Think of all the millions of profit that the house builders have made in the last 30 years. How many times that we see in the papers of a weekend when we're browsing through, there's been a problem with this particular site up in the Midlands, or there's another problem with this particular site down in the southeast. It happens all the time. It defies logic why clients don't employ a clerk of works to look after their quality control needs.
So whilst on the topic of cost, how does a clerk of works go about putting together a fee for their service? Because I'm thinking this might be a barrier to why a client perhaps doesn't see or doesn't want to bring a clerk of works on board, because he's seeing the project budget getting higher, and then also looking at it from slightly smaller projects, or if you want to call them grassroots clients or contractors. How much can they look to pay towards this service? Larger companies, slightly easier, but let's say smaller companies.
Smaller companies will probably have an issue with some of those things, and I understand that. But then, if you're looking at a large scheme of say 7, 8, 9, 15 million pounds, the cost of a clerk of works per year to do say 4 or 5 visits a week is negligible. To able to help with the handover process, to help with the snagging. The cost of that is negligible compared with the cost of remediation. Of that, there is no doubt. The cost of repairs, of actually putting a job back together again because something has missed off, or because it wasn't put in, because it wasn't put in properly in the first place. The cost of a clerk of works for a year may be some £40,000. That's got to be money well spent. With smaller projects, yes, of course, a lot of projects wouldn't be able to afford that cost, but they can surely afford maybe a visit by a small independent clerk of works, a couple of visits per week maybe, just to give them that peace of mind. You're right in what you're saying. I mean, the cost of we found obviously in the past that the cost to provide a clerk of works often ends up being squeezed because of lack of some sufficient money to go round, and that's always been a bit of a problem. But this is why a lot of clients on smaller projects believe that the building control officer is there to serve them, which of course they're not. They're there to make sure that the building regulation items are complied with. They won't necessarily see the quality control items that a clerk of works would tend to look after. Indeed, that's very true. Yeah.
Yeah. And by then, normally, when the building controls come on board, the project's already been completed and built. So
Well, this is it. I mean,
you
nowadays, I
can't.
mean, the key thing that we clerk of works will get involved in nowadays is checking all the fire stopping. And although the main contractors now have an obligation to make sure that the fire stopping is all absolutely in place, one of the things you'll often find at handover is clerk of works pushing up suspended ceilings or opening riser cupboard doors just to make sure that no other extra cables have been pushed through the fire stopping and made sure it was all made sure it was all put back in place properly. I mean, yes, of course, building control and approved inspectors, yes, they will check fire stopping, but they don't have time to go around and check every single piece of fire stopping or floor penetration that's been done, um, because they haven't got time for that. They haven't got time for that.
Yeah. Okay, so just to wrap up our discussion, where can our listeners go to find out more information about the role of the clerk of works, or where to find a clerk of works to appoint for their projects, or just to keep up to date with the trends of the clerk of work and their contribution to a project and the construction industry?
Right. Well, there's two things I should mention. Very only last year, late last year, the RIBA produced a handbook from RIBA Publishing called the Clerk of Works in Site Inspector Handbook, and it does basically give a complete guide as to what the Clerk of Works does, what he's supposed to look at. And in terms of his role, what he's supposed to be looking at, what he checks off, and it also gives a guide to clerk of works who are in employment, of course. And the Institute of Clerk of Works are based in Peterborough, and they are also on they're also on the website, of course, www.Institute of Clerks of Works of Great Britain, and they are on LinkedIn and Twitter as well, I believe. ICWCI/GB or _GB, I think it more possibly. They have a very good team at the head office in Peterborough who will deal with any inquiries, anybody who wishes to know about clerk of works. There are various people in the clerk of works industry who'll come out and give talks and demonstrations about how these can benefit the client, of course. I've done a few myself at a number of conferences, construction conferences. So, yeah, excuse me, anybody who's out there thinking of employing a clerk of works, please do get involved. It'll be the best money you've